portfolios. And they do that by hosting transparent, accessible and discoverable insight, and enabling knowledge sharing, co-creation and adoption of best practice. And Jonathan will be talking about knowledge mapping and how to establish the parameters for a knowledge management program. So welcome, Jonathan. Thank you for joining us. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks, David. It's good. I was enjoying Hank's the last part of Hank's presentation, which was great.
Yeah, very good, actually, very good. We've got a web page open there. We can see that it's not a slide. It looks like it's a web page, which is absolutely fine. So it's over to you. Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, you should be able to see there that there's a message there's a note that go to www.menti.com and use the code 96158313. And if you'd like to pull out your mobile phones and do that, then you'll be able to respond to the poll that I'm going to launch in a little while.
Brilliant.
So I don't know how many of you have used Mentimeter. It's one of those new pieces of software that's come around in the last few years, but it's a great way of engaging people either in presentations or indeed just in general. So good. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you for the next 15 minutes or so about the subject of visualizing knowledge through knowledge mapping. I hope you've got a good idea of the value of knowledge management from what you've already heard today. And I want to just introduce you to two techniques that you can use that I think will help you manage knowledge for individuals and also as an organization. So let's start with a little story. Back in 2015, a company called Carter, which was a startup equity platform, embarked on an experiment, which was to map what they called their shadow organization. And they did this by asking their 250 employees 3 separate questions. They asked them, who energizes you at work? Who do you go to for help and advice? And who do you go to when a decision is needed? And they invited them to list 4 or more people in response to each of those questions. And then they did a kind of network diagram, and you can see that on the right-hand side, the rather blurred image on the right-hand side of the slide. And they found some interesting stuff. The first thing they found was that the top 10 people, not the top 10%, but the top 10 people, the top 10 most connected, most influential people in their organization influenced 70% of the workforce. And if they moved 2 degrees out, so if they looked at employees who were influenced by employees who were influenced by the top 10, they actually had coverage of 100% of their employees. It's worth noting that the shadow organization didn't bear any resemblance to the formal organization chart, so that the CEO wasn't anywhere near the top 10, for example. And I think it's a really good exercise to do, and it really shows you that if you want people to know stuff, find out who are the top 10 influencers in your organization and start talking to them. So you might think it's a bit weird, because my life is much closer to the kind of world that Hank was describing with lessons learned. I manage the Major Projects Knowledge Repository, and I spend a lot of time collating and curating reports and lessons learned. So why am I so focused on people? The reason is because of this. And over the last 20 or more years, the world has changed fundamentally for business. This is what the great Professor Eddie Obeng describes as the world after midnight. And it happened to every business, including your business. It's just a case of when it happened. And it's basically the date when the speed of change overtook your capacity to learn. Previously, organizations could kind of keep learning and keep ahead of change. But now, nobody can keep up, unfortunately. Now, that's pretty painful for my industry, because we're looking at repeatable processes, developing consistent projects and programs. We're looking at lessons learned, all of these kinds of things. But basically what this is saying is you can't really trust what you've learned up to now, because it may have no relevance at all. In fact, it may be totally wrong. So the pandemic has kind of brought that into kind of stark focus. It hasn't changed that, but it's really kind of torn away the curtain that we could pretend that we could keep up. So here's the poll. And if you'd like to, as I say, just go to Menti and respond to the question, how does your organization manage knowledge? And you can respond with a technical question, a technical response, that's fine. Or you can respond with a value statement. They're fantastic, they're rubbish, whatever you like. Or you can say, I don't know. If you don't know, that's fine. Just type in, I don't know. And I'll just give you sort of 15 or so seconds to do that. We've already got some great examples up there. Okay, I do, yeah. ITIL, yeah, okay. I mean, a lot of things that we kind of expect. Yeah, great stuff. Fantastic. So obviously there are some, and I guess it's probably the ones with the dedicated knowledge management team who are already doing that. But very clearly, very kind of technical tools. That seems to be the emphasis, which is interesting. I think it's interesting anyway, given what I'm talking about in terms of the human side of knowledge management. Because what I'd like to do is I'd like you to imagine that you had to represent your company's knowledge as a map and to think what might that look like. Now that's something that my generation learned from an early age, and I think even today's generation, you know, you're familiar with Google Maps and SatNav. So kind of reading a map and making sense of a map is still a basic skill that we use to help us kind of take a two-dimensional space or a route and translate it into a mental map, something that we can call on and we can kind of revisit when we need it. The first task I set you was to map the shadow organization. And now I'm going to suggest that you build a map of your organization's knowledge. And you can do this in a variety of ways. You can do it socially, so you can get a massive roll of paper and arm everybody with a Sharpie and ask them to add items onto the map, topographical features, roads, whatever they want. Or you can ask people to create their own personal A2 maps. So you get everybody's different map of what they think knowledge looks like. Or you could use a Miro whiteboard or some other virtual whiteboard and actually do it virtually. The whole point is what you're trying to do is you're trying to teach people the idea of a kind of topography of knowledge and a common language of knowledge. You know, where are the blobs of knowledge and how do they relate to each other in the organization? Now, I suspect that the easiest bits to start with will be the explicit knowledge. So those are the processes, the schedules, the structures, the products that you can describe in writing and that you can learn by reading about them. You might use, these could be perhaps maybe the bus routes and the train routes and the timetables on your map. In major projects terms, these are the kind of Gantt charts, the flow diagrams, the engineering blueprints, the risk registers that are associated with a major project. Because the problem with this kind of knowledge is, first of all, the world after midnight. The minute you create any kind of document, a strategy document, a schedule, piece of software, video, whatever it is, it's out of date. And the second problem is these things are only knowledge if they are assimilated, if everybody in the organization can assimilate the information that they contain. I was a publisher for most of my career, and the last 12 months of my 30-year publishing career, I was in a huge multinational, and they had a massive database which contained every piece of information about a book, including, you know, the author, the blurb, the dimensions, the publishing, the bibliographic details, sales data, print data, reprint data, rights data. Trouble was, it was so arcane that the only way of getting information effectively out of that, particularly if you wanted something unusual, like, you know, have I sold Japanese rights in this book, was to ask somebody in the rights department who was inputting data into the database. So, you know, we all have these fantastic systems, but they don't necessarily translate into knowledge. The other thing that you want to capture on your map is tacit knowledge. So this is the kind of how do you do something knowledge, the kind of thing that you can really only learn by experience, by watching somebody else. I describe this as kind of what some people may know, because basically there's no guarantee with anything in tacit that anybody in your business knows what to do, particularly if it's something you haven't done before. Maybe nobody knows how to do it. But equally, even if they do know how to do it, they may not be aware that they know how to do it. If you think about everything that you've done since the pandemic started, some of those things will have been, really weird, and you may have struggled with them. Other things, maybe you've never done them before, but you intuitively, you just knew how to do them. And that's the trouble with tacit knowledge is you really don't often know what you know. I'm suggesting you use markets, pubs, stadiums, kind of social spaces, environments as the metaphors for your tacit knowledge. Remember, this is a metaphorical map, so you're not trying to draw it to scale. But what's going to be interesting is to see how many pubs, markets, or stadiums people draw on the map, how big they are, how they relate to each other, or maybe there aren't any at all. So that indeed will also tell you something. You also need to deal with your data black holes. Now, this can be quite painful, but you want maybe to encourage people to look at those bits of the business where maybe people seem to keep everything they know to themselves. That might be a swamp, or where the information is so complicated or even complex that if you try to communicate it, nobody can understand it, which is a kind of forest where you can't see the wood for the trees. And then you'll have some deserts. You'll have some areas of knowledge where you really have no information and no knowledge at all. Whether that's about customer churn data, user preferences, competitor data, whatever it is. Quite painful. Maybe you'd rather not know about the swamps, forests, and deserts, but actually, if you know about them, you can start to have a conversation about what are we going to do to kind of drain this swamp or to irrigate this desert. So you can stop there basically if you want. This process is as simple or as complicated as you want to make it, and I think it depends on the value that you feel you're getting out of it, whether people are engaging with it, whether it's really opening up some interesting conversations about what you know and don't know, and the value of your knowledge. But if you want to go on, you can maybe have a look at the edge of the map. So what are the emerging frontiers? What are those areas of knowledge that are just opening up, but probably represent the future of the business? And think about drawing them as the boundaries or as the borders. And because once you start to identify them, again, you can then work out a strategy to kind of start exploring this unknown territory. I'll give you an example of how this can change. If you think about the UK defence industry and their kind of world after midnight moment, a few years ago, they used to think in terms of hardware. So they would think, we need a new aeroplane, we need a new system, we need a new tank, we need a new ship. But if you talk to them now, everything they talk about is in terms of capability. We need to be able to defend the UK from cyber incursion. And if you think about that idea and think about what that means in terms of knowledge, you kind of understand where I'm coming from. The other thing that you might like to add to your map are your heroes and villains. So you might be a bit circumspect in naming the villains on your map, particularly if they're influential, important people. You don't necessarily want to blight your career by accusing somebody of being a villain. But in terms of the heroes, you may already have got them. If you've mapped your shadow organization, then you know who your top 10 people or your top 20 people are. You're kind of nomads with a K, the sort of creative, imaginative, and innovative people who can work with anybody at any time and anywhere. And you're going to want to think about how you're going to leverage their influence and how you're going to support their work. So in terms of the heroes, maybe you should consider adding a knowledge management specific role to their objectives. Or maybe you talk to them about freeing up some of their time to allow them to fulfill this kind of informal knowledge role that they've got. Or you look at ways of providing them with opportunities to showcase what they know, or opportunities to coach other members of staff. And if you're doing all that, you also need to think about how you recognize their contribution. Villains, these might be people who don't necessarily see the value of knowledge management. Perhaps they ignore the need to capture and share knowledge, or they hoard knowledge as a source of power, or they simply ignore it. And if you have a look at that and have a think about them, and what does that tell you about the culture of the organization and how it needs to change? Do remember, villains are stakeholders too, and they may be very influential. So again, you're going to need to think up some strategies for dealing with your villains. So some strategies and some techniques that's going to turn them from the dark side, so that, you know, they're no longer the villain of the piece. So I think Hank alluded to this. He talked about the objectives and the importance of the objectives. And I think you do need to kind of start with the end in mind, whether you're mapping the shadow organization or doing this visualizing knowledge mapping exercise. You need to have articulated your knowledge management as a convincing and coherent strategic goal, one that avoids jargon and explains what you want to achieve through knowledge management. And you should use this as a litmus test for any activities that you are pursuing, whether that's the shadow organization or visualizing knowledge. And I have a little technique that you might like to help you kind of connect what you're doing with value. And it's called PRUB logic. And PRUB stands for projects which produce results that users can translate into benefits. So if we give you an example, your project is to introduce a process for mapping knowledge, and that will allow you to visualize how and why knowledge is valuable to the business. So that's your result, and allow you to do that in a way that will enable your employees to start focusing on exploiting the knowledge generated by their various activities to inform how the business should change and where it should go. So you've got the users, the employees, and you've got the benefits. The value is basically, it's telling you where your business should be going. And I think, just ending on that note, coming back to this idea of the people in knowledge management, PRUB and the PRUB model kind of reminds you that you cannot do anything, you can't realize any value from your knowledge activities without your users. You depend on your users, whether that's employees, customers, partners, or other stakeholders, because basically it's their behavior and their change behavior as a result of whatever you're doing that will drive performance and competitive advantage. So there you go. That's me done. A couple of techniques, and I hope that was useful. And it gives us a couple of minutes if we have any questions.
Fantastic there, and that was another great insight there, Jonathan. Thank you very much indeed. We've not got a huge amount of questions that have come through, which is absolutely fine actually, because I've got one or two I'd probably like to ask. I think much of this we've talked all day really about the cultures, you know, the culture of the right people. You spoke there about the villains and the heroes and that kind of sort of approach to trying to get people on board. It's not always easy, especially in a fast-moving large organization as well. where do you start? So if we look at recruitment as the starting place to build culture, how do you recruit the right person and people that are going to be people who will buy into this? Are there any differences between, I don't know, people who are a little bit longer in the tooth and people who are a little bit younger because of the way that they use technology? I don't know. Have you any thoughts on that, on recruiting responsibly for knowledge management?
That's a really good question, David. I don't think there's absolutely no link between age or experience. I think the whole point about this is kind of functionally neutral. So you'll find your top 10 people, you'll find your kind of knowledge nomads, your knowledge brokers right across the business. You'll find some of them, in IT, some of them in engineering, some of them in HR, wherever they are. And it's about behaviors. And fundamentally, you're looking for curiosity. You're looking for a lot of the things that you would look for in general in this kind of fast-moving world. So you're looking for self-awareness. That's pretty fundamental, because if you're aware of yourself, you start to be aware of other people. And I think that idea of awareness, if you come back to the map that I described, do people seem to know where they are and where they're going, and do they have some interesting ideas for what might be beyond the borders in your organization? If you kind of ask them what's the next big thing in service desk management or in knowledge management or whatever it is, and listen to what they're kind of saying, because it is about kind of imagination. It's about sort of social skills, so the ability to engage people, the ability to have a conversation with people. But there's no simple, I'm afraid there's no simple answer to that question. Good.
And yeah, you're absolutely right. There isn't, is there? I think it's an art in itself. It's been a very interesting day today, actually, and some of the stuff, the conclusions that I've certainly come to in managing it does revolve around, you can have the greatest group of people in the world when we talk about people who know stuff, but it is about exercising that responsibly and understanding that there is a much bigger picture than just you sort of managing your little bit in that jigsaw puzzle. Yes. That's been great. Thank you very much indeed. Look, really enjoyed that, Jonathan. Thank you very much. Hopefully we'll get a chance maybe to do this again very soon. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks, David. And thanks everybody out there.
Brilliant. Good. Okay. So for those who missed the break last time, we've got a break now. So we've got pretty much lunch, really. It's a little bit shorter than maybe a traditional lunch break, but we've got some 40 minutes really. So it's a chance to grab a tea,